But thank you, Dr. Bowie, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today to give this talk. So my name, like he said, is Arifa Raza, and I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. And so I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Let's see, and I got to get used to this. So today I'll be sharing with you a chapter out of my book project, which looks at immigration enforcement endeavors, specifically family separation through the lens of humanitarianism. So first, I'll provide an overview of my book project. So it's currently being worked on, but it's tentatively titled Deterrence Through Protection, Unaccompanied Children, and the Racialized Discourse of Immigration. Then I'll go into chapter 4 of the book, which looks at a child-specific humanitarian remedy called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status and how it functions, I argue, to criminalize Central American families. And then I'll conclude with implications for immigration reform. So we'll go big, what's the big argument in my book, and then we'll go into one of my chapters. So before we begin, I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about my background. Like Dr. Bowie said, I was an immigration lawyer before coming to academia. So I came from an immigrant family. I'm first gen. My mother is Guatemalan. So I grew up with stories about migration, immigration, the journeys that my mom and other family members have taken to come to the United States. I also heard stories around the Civil War that took place in Guatemala. So in fact, I spent my first birthday in Guatemala at the height of the Civil War that was taking place there. So I share this with you because it really shaped and influenced both my academic and my professional experience and trajectory. So professionally, I began my doctoral studies before going to law school. So I went to UC Riverside in ethnic studies, and it was through the research that I did there on human rights and immigration law that led me to law school. So then I went to UCLA Law, and there I focused on international and comparative law, and I did internships throughout Los Angeles, specifically in immigrant rights organizations, as well as immigration court. So then when I graduated UCLA Law, I started practicing. And so my first job out of law school was working at the Central American Resource Center, which is a Central American organization that was founded and ran by Central American refugees. And it was founded in the 1980s refugee movement in response to Central Americans fleeing El Salvador and Guatemala from the civil wars there. So in that job, I provided deportation defense to unaccompanied migrant children. And so this was during the time of the first crisis on the border of unaccompanied children who were arriving at the US-Mexico border. So in my work providing deportation defense, I kept coming across a federal law called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which is a federal law that provides comprehensive protections for victims of human trafficking, but it also regulates what protections are available for migrant children. And so I started becoming interested in understanding how unaccompanied minors get incorporated within this larger trafficking framework and within the larger trafficking movement or anti-trafficking movement. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I moved to New Mexico. So yeah, it wasn't Arizona, it was New Mexico. Southwest. So I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I worked there in detention centers throughout the state of New Mexico and in El Paso, Texas, representing detained individuals. So in that work, I kept coming across fathers who were victims of something called the family separation policy. So I'm sharing all of this with you all today because it's through those experiences that led me to this specific project and informs my understanding of these seemingly diverse but interconnected issues within immigration. So we have like trafficking, unaccompanied children, and family separation. Actually, let me see if oh, no. I'll just maybe do that. There we go. So like I mentioned, I worked previously in detention centers throughout New Mexico and El Paso. So I want to share a story that I think highlights family separation. So one day I met a single father from El Salvador in El Paso, and he was detained. He had fled with his daughter from El Salvador after being threatened by a gang who wanted him to work for them. After he refused, they threatened to kill him, and they burned his house down. So, you know, they're really serious. The threats are very much real. So he decides to flee immediately with nothing but like a backpack with a couple things. So he flees from El Salvador. He comes to the United States with his daughter, hoping to seek asylum in the United States. But when he arrives to the US-Mexico border, instead of being seen as a family deserving of protection, Border Patrol separated him from his daughter and sent him to prison on federal prison on federal unauthorized entry charges. And his daughter was then sent to a detention center for children. And she was reclassified as an unaccompanied child, meaning she has no legal guardian or parent. So she was sent to New York. So, like I said, this is a case of the family separation policy. So what is the family separation policy? In July of 2017, the Trump administration embarked on this unprecedented policy of separating migrant children from their parents at the border in order to deter immigration. So the policy became public in May of 2018 when the Attorney General at the time announced a zero tolerance policy under which basically parents, including asylum seekers, would be prosecuted criminally for unauthorized entry, and their children would be forcibly removed from their custody and reclassified as unaccompanied. So the policy resulted in over 5,500 children being separated from their parents. To make matters worse, parents weren't reunified with their children. There was no system in place from the Department of Homeland Security for reuniting families or even tracking them. So what ends up happening is you have parents who are getting deported back to their home countries, and they have no idea where their children are, and their children have no idea what happened to their parents. So a court case was filed to enjoin or to stop the family separation policy, and it was ultimately enjoined by a district court judge. So in that court order, the judge ordered the Department of Homeland Security to stop this practice and to reunify the families that were separated. However, within this court order, the federal court judge said that that separations could continue under specific circumstances. So specifically, parents with criminal histories or where there are concerns over human trafficking. And so, although the family separation policy technically has ended, migrant families arriving along the US-Mexico border are still being separated under these specific circumstances. So again, criminal history and trafficking suspicion. So while the zero tolerance policy and the resulting separating of families was cruel, I just want to take a moment to remind us it's not new. Historically, the tactic of separating families has been used since the founding of the United States and can be understood as one of the central tenets to the U.S. nation-building project. So I put up a couple key points in history for you all. But the project of enslaving people relied on the threat of separating children from their mothers and relying on the codification of race-based slavery to facilitate selling children and forcibly taking them away from family. Post-slavery or post-Civil War, and in the wake of desegregation, Black families become criticized for not conforming to U.S. ideal standards of a nuclear family, which ultimately gets linked with criminality and as part of a larger movement towards penalizing the use of social services and getting kids funneled into the foster care system. So post-slavery, now we're judging families, criminalizing families and separating families through the foster care system. Separating families was also key to the settler colonial project, as seen through the use of Indian boarding schools. So in the late 1870s, the United States forced indigenous children to attend boarding schools where they are forced to assimilate, lose their own culture and language, which effectively is trying to disrupt like tribal sovereignty, tribal relations, under the guise of civilizing children. And then later, the same thing we see, officials begin taking Native children from their families through policing, welfare, and social services. And it's through the foster care system that we see Native families being torn apart. Although ultimately that one did lead to the Indian Welfare Act or Child Welfare Act because of a lot of resistance and movements against it. But nonetheless, the welfare system became one of those tools where you're seeing families being separated. And then you can also, and a little bit more recent, so that was maybe mid-20th century, we also then see the rise in family separations through mass incarceration. So the 1970s and 80s, we see the expansion of the prison industrial complex, coupled with the war on drugs and the war on crime, which leads to over-policing of Black and brown communities. And over-policing leads to over-incarceration. And so you're having families being separated through the prison system. I think in one statistic, by 2015, 1 in 9 Black children had at least one parent in prison, effectively meaning they're separated from their family. And then in the 90s, you have the rise of interior immigration enforcement initiatives, coupled with immigration reforms, which targets immigrants with criminal records, even petty records like petty theft. So we have a targeting of immigrants within the interior, which leads to immigrant detention and immigrant deportation, again, separating families. So today we're talking about the family separation policy that occurred 2017 through 2018, although we can see that it's still functioning. I also wanted to remind people, and I put it here in I think small letters, but where's the little poker? The Migrant Protection Protocol, that was the Remain in Mexico program, which essentially forced people or asylum seekers trying to get to the United States, they forced them into Mexico, wouldn't let them into the United States, or if they did, when they came to the US border, Border Patrol would separate families and say, you can go, you can stay, you're gonna go to detention. So again, separating families. So I just wanted to give this historical context so that we can all kind of understand this latest iteration of family separation. So I also wanna recognize and note that while breaking apart families in the context of settler colonialism and slavery is not necessarily the same as separating migrants at the border, it still relies on similar logics of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, which we'll talk about and work through a little bit later in the talk. So, returning back to my book, I guess that's good. Returning back to my book, considering the zero tolerance policy and the continued separation of migrant parents from their children, under the guise of like protecting children from crime or criminals and trafficking. How does the criminalization of immigration work hand in hand with advancements in humanitarian-based policies, such as those concerning human trafficking and migrant children? In my book, which again it's tentatively called, and it's a very long name, so I apologize, I argue that recent immigration enforcement measures have advanced through legal developments around unaccompanied migrant children, which have dovetailed with the politics and discourse around combating human trafficking. For some background, beginning in the 90s, I talked about immigration reform and the rise of interior enforcement. So this is a time where you see immigration really converging with criminal law, giving rise to laws focused on the criminalization of migration. However, at the same time, you do see some legal developments around human trafficking, which offered some protections to foreign national victims or immigrant victims of trafficking. And within that, you start seeing those protections expand to migrant children. So by interrogating the current iteration of family separation through the prism of human trafficking and the legal developments around unaccompanied children, my book details how humanitarian protections developed over the past 30 years have been used to advance and justify immigration enforcement and deterrence measure. The book further examines the convergence between protections around trafficking and migrant children and how it not only criminalizes migrants and migration, but also advances the racialization of migrants and immigrants. So while historians such as Laura Briggs have traced the recent family separation to the larger history of racist state violence against Black and Native communities, this book explicitly traces how legal developments and policies reflect the racializing dynamic immigration law has on Central American immigrants, who are among the most impacted by recent anti-immigrant policies. So in the book, I'm arguing that humanitarian immigration policies ultimately support and justify immigration enforcement initiatives that are grounded in deterrence. So to make this argument, I build off of these three fields: critical refugee studies, Central American studies, and critical race studies. So while the book foregrounds legal and political developments around migrant children and victims of trafficking, it does so through the lens of these fields. So just to give everyone a one-sentence overview of what these fields are, critical refugee studies pushes us to understand humanitarianism and human rights within the larger context of imperialism and colonialism. By doing so, we can map how humanitarian laws, such as refugee law, or in this case, laws around protecting children, mask the larger structures that drive dislocation, and how these laws ultimately end up reinforcing colonial relationships. And then to understand Central American migration and immigration policies developed in a response to it, I build off of Central American studies. Like critical refugee studies, Central American studies takes into account U.S. intervention within the isthmus. So given the unique history of U.S. intervention and U.S. imperialism and continued intervention in the region, scholars of Central American studies have developed a transnational analytical framework that accounts for how U.S. intervention impacts migration from the region, as well as how it structures the lives of Central Americans in the United States. And then lastly, I engage with critical race studies, including, or specifically, critical race theory, to expose how laws, including humanitarian ones, function to advance violence and works to racialize groups. And in this case, again, we're looking at Central American migrants. So for the book, I just wanted to give everyone, like, what am I looking at? How am I looking at things? So my methods. Data collected include congressional records, case summaries, legal cases, case law, immigration training, advocacy, as well as media accounts. In terms of specific methods, I specifically use critical race theory as a methodology. So as a methodology, CRT, or critical race theory, has developed an approach towards interrogating the law, which Angela Harris calls a hermeneutics of skepticism. And then basically what this approach does is it places the development of laws within the larger political, social, and historical context in order to identify the continuity of racial oppression across time. And for those of you that are thinking of going into law school, if you were to go to law school, you are taught to abstract, that the law is abstracted from social and economic political realities. So this is basically saying, no, the law is directly related to social, economic, political, context at the time. So just FYI for my pre-law students. So in my own work, I situate the legal and policy developments around unaccompanied children within this larger social and political context to show how these laws are effectively in reaction to events occurring in Central America at the time. Additionally, I employ discourse analysis to trace how humanitarian narratives get taken up by government officials and lawmakers in discussions around immigration and immigration enforcement, to shed light into how racial ideologies and criminalizing tactics get articulated through arguments around protecting children. So lastly, I use grounded theory as a way to code and categorize data thematically. So taking a step back, I'm doing critical race theory, discourse analysis, looking at all these different things. Taking a step back, my focus here is at two levels, the discursive level and the level of law and policy. So scholars across disciplines have established the role of discourse in advancing ideologies and maintaining power, which manifests themselves in various ways, including through the law. So by examining the stories, narratives, and arguments lawmakers and government officials articulate about what we call the immigration crisis, we can uncover those racial ideologies and criminalizing tactics at play, which informs and are informed by the political and legal responses. And I keep wanting to touch your keyboard. So here's an outline of my book. Titles might change, right, from now till when it gets published. But here's an outline of my book. The book is comprised of 5 chapters that are chronologically sequenced, each providing additional layers, which advances the book's main argument that the developments around protecting migrant children have reinforced rather than mitigated the criminalization of immigration and has strengthened the immigration enforcement regime. So my first 2 chapters excavates the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which, like I mentioned earlier, is not only the first comprehensive federal law on human trafficking, but it also expanded protections for unaccompanied migrant children. So through a deep dive into the congressional history of the TVPA and its subsequent reauthorizations, these 2 chapters detail how racialized and gendered discursive formulations of trafficking victims work to advance trafficking protections, but also how it laid the foundation laid the groundwork to criminalize migration and criminalize families and parents in particular. The subsequent 2 chapters examine legal cases, congressional hearings, and reports and media accounts, documenting the discursive and political effects the Trafficking Victim Protection Act had on immigrant children and families. So here I'm focused on 2 specific amendments. The expansion of the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Visa, which is what we'll be talking about today, and the placement policies for unaccompanied children. So together, chapters 3 and 4 reveal how expanded protections for unaccompanied children work to frame immigrant parents as criminal and potential traffickers, allowing then for the heightened policing of immigrant families. And then The final chapter shows the effects of the protections, of those protections, how it ultimately provided political and discursive justification for the zero tolerance family separation policy. Oh, bless you. Okay. So now that was the big overview of the book. Now I'd like to turn to chapter 4 of the book, which explores a humanitarian visa called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. And again, it provides immigration relief to migrant children. So unaccompanied children came to the public's attention in 2014 when thousands of minors from Central America began presenting themselves at the US-Mexico border without a parent or legal guardian. So in 2014, there was over 68,000 unaccompanied children who were apprehended. They were fleeing persecution and violence in their home countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and were seeking refuge in the United States. And many of them were trying to reunify with parents who were already living in the US. So those who were apprehended by Border Patrol were processed according to the regulations brought about by the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. So that meant, some of the main protection here is that rather than being summarily deported, they instead are placed in immigration proceedings and transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Many of them ultimately qualified and were granted this visa, so Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. So actually, let me go here. Actually, no, we'll go here. So like I said, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status is this visa specifically for children. It's to be eligible for this visa, the child had to have either been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent or both parents. So through analyzing Central American SIJS, or Special Immigrant Juvenile cases, I argue the legal requirement for eligibility for this immigration relief ultimately works to criminalize immigration or migration, and at the same time racialize the Central American family through the heteropatriarchal ideal of the family. So what is heteropatriarchy? It's essentially a social system premised on heterosexuality and patriarchy. It functions to naturalize social and racial hierarchies to uphold white supremacy. In the United States, indigenous and black feminists have exposed how this has been used to uphold slavery and settler colonialism, and how it continues to be one of the main or primary organizing principles that maintains social, racial, and economic hierarchies today. For example, indigenous feminists like Shannon Speed have shown how ideas around the heteropatriarchal family, led with the male patriarch, was used to destabilize Native families and communities, and helps us to explain the ongoing settler colonial project that renders indigenous women vulnerable to violence. Also, the work of Patricia Hill Collins has shed light into the logic of heteropatriarchy, and again, that idealized nuclear family, how it maintains hierarchies of gender, race, class, and nation, and how we think of the nation through these ideals. Importantly, heteropatriarchy functions as the foundation for white supremacy, together with racism. At the same time, heteropatriarchy functions to racialize and ultimately uphold racial difference. So I put like a little concept map, I guess, of how we can think of how heteropatriarchy functions. So here you have heteropatriarchy. It gets deployed through these cultural logics that assumes heterosexuality and patriarchy are the norm, and therefore groups that don't adhere to those norms are deemed culturally inferior. This in turn advances the racialization process of groups and upholds racial difference, which in turn is supported by a criminal legal system that renders specific groups vulnerable to increased surveillance, policing, and ultimately incarceration. And when I'm talking about incarceration, I also include immigrant detention. So we will see how heteropatriarchy works in the context of special immigrant juvenile status. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you all an overview. So again, like I said, SIJS, or Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, is a humanitarian protection for children who have been abused, abandoned, neglected by a parent or both parents. If they're granted this visa, they can apply for legal permanent residency, so that's like a green card, and eventually you have a pathway for citizenship or naturalization. So to qualify for this visa, you have to go through a state court and get evidence from a state court. So this is really unique in immigration law, where the underlying evidence has to be determined in a state court. So like a custody or dependency or guardianship type proceeding. And so these state court judges are the ones making determinations on whether a child has been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And additionally, they have to find that it's not in the best interest of a child to be returned to their home country. So they're responsible for making decisions based on the evidence in the record about the safety, medical, and educational opportunities in the child's country as compared to the United States, right? And so for this to be well litigated, the worst parts of the home country have to be emphasized. And so once you have those state court proceedings, you can then go to immigration and apply for special immigrant juvenile status. So another, just a reminder of the state court findings. So for me, my question to you are what are the consequences of special immigrant juvenile status where state courts apply domestic law in order to make determinations regarding Central American countries? Oh, sorry. So I argue that it's problematic because first, it requires an ahistoric application of the law that doesn't consider the United States' role in creating conditions in home countries that have led to this out-migration. And secondly, it applies US laws and norms to Central American countries, which essentially works to criminalize entire regions outside the United States. And so another little caveat to this is outside of immigration practitioners, special immigrant juvenile status isn't really discussed. And so one of the main objectives of this chapter is to show like that discursive effect of the substantive part of this law and how it's related to the racialization and criminalization, in this case of Central American migrants. So in this chapter, I analyzed case summaries from litigated Central American SIJ cases, meaning that these were cases where applicants went to the state court and the state court made those findings on abuse, abandonment, neglect, and the best interest of the child, and whether or not they should be sent back to home country. So these cases all went through state court. They got their SIJS findings, and then they applied for special immigrant juvenile status. So the cases that I analyzed were gathered from a nonprofit in Los Angeles that specialized in representing unaccompanied children in SIJ cases. And the cases that I got were litigated in state court between 2015 and 2016. And all the applicants, like I said, went to state court, applied for special immigrant juvenile status, and were granted the status. And eventually, I think most of them, legal permanent residency. So while the cases that I look at come from California, they are representative of special immigrant juvenile cases nationally, given that SIJS is a federal immigration remedy. But I also cross-reference these cases against advocacy and training materials available nationally. And just to give you, I'll use the little pointer again, just to give you like a little explanation. So this is what I got, this is the data that I looked at, right? So these are the case summaries. So those case summaries are what are the basis for the state court orders. These were attached to this application. This is the immigration application. And it's just biometric information. And then this is what's attached to it. So that's what I'm looking at, but that's how it relates. So we're looking at the cases get attached to these applications, filed, and then eventually they get granted, hopefully. And then, like I said, I cross-referenced against national organizations and organizations working on special immigrant juvenile status. So a review of the cases from that data reveals common narratives that complicate, what I think complicate Central American children's claims for humanitarian relief by relying on heteropatriarchal ideals, which in turn uphold racial difference. So these are the themes that emerged from my analysis. So the first theme is Central American fathers being framed as a source of abuse and abandonment. In nearly all the cases, in all the cases that I reviewed, the father was either abandoned the family or was never there to begin with. And where there are fathers within the family, they're being framed as a source of abuse or neglect. And so the fathers in these cases are depicted as divergent from the typical patriarchal leader of a family. And then the second theme that I found is the issue of economic instability and economic instability being taken as evidence of neglect. So here I found the criminalization of economic migration appears discursively through condemning non-nuclear families, which results in the migration of mainly mothers. So in this narrative, the economic migration of parents creates the conditions for any traumatic experience that occurs to the child while under the care of extended family. So related to the economic migration of parents, which contributes to abuse, abandonment, or neglect of the child, there's also this economic criminalization of poor countries where economic instability and poverty is taken as evidence of neglect. And then the third theme, children left with extended families contributing to their abuse, abandonment, or neglect. So here, without a traditional heteropatriarchal household to depend on, Central American mothers in general are unable to provide for their children, causing them to migrate north. While again, it depicts mothers as having like these noble intentions to help support their families, it ultimately places fault on them for leaving children in the care of extended family who are abusive, neglectful, or just generally unable to provide for their safety. So understood through the concept of heteropatriarchy, where heteropatriarchy constructs the ideal family as a heterosexual two-parent household where you have the male who's the breadwinner, the female parent as the caretaker and nurturer. SIJS cases basically position the Central American family as divergent from that ideal and then represents the consequences of that divergence. And then the last theme I wanted to note is the issue of gang violence and impunity. In nearly all the Central American claims that I analyzed, gang violence is either the impetus for fleeing or an exacerbating factor in making the decision to flee. It's also taken as proof that it's not in the best interest for the child to be returned to their home country. So by accepting this narrative of criminality, state courts are denouncing entire countries as violent and lacking in rule of law. So these perceived like violent conditions, coupled with that underlying abuse, abandonment, and neglect, create this image of Central America where violence, corruption, and culturally inferior norms give rise to the mistreatment of children. So, let me drink some water, hold on. So to better see how these themes emerge, I wanted to work through 2 SIJS cases. And just note, these are real life cases, but they're written through the eyes or through the language of an attorney, which is a whole other discussion related to like legal violence and but yeah, so I just wanted to flag that these are taken from the case studies that I got, or case summaries, which were written by lawyers or paralegals. So in this case, we have Rosa, and she is from El Salvador. When her mother was pregnant with her father, or when her mother was pregnant, her father would beat her. And then he ultimately abandoned Rosa when she was about 8 months old. So then, struggling to support Rosa, her mother decides to migrate to the United States to work and send money for her when she was 3 years old. So Rosa's mother left her in the care of her maternal grandmother, and under the care of the grandmother, she was a victim of sexual abuse and gang harassment. So the local gang begins threatening her on her way to school. They wanted her to join the gang and be the girlfriend of a member, but she refused and went to the police. But the police didn't investigate anything. Rather, the gang found out that she went to the police and started threatening to kill her and her family. So then, fearing for her life and that of her family, she fled El Salvador to reunite with her mother. So in this case, she qualifies for SIJS because, 1, her father abandoned her, so we need that abuse, abandonment, or neglect. But 2, it's not in the best interest to return her to home country because she experienced gang threats and sexual abuse in home country, which demonstrates, it's not in the best interest for her to be returned. However, looking at the underlying logics, we can see how heteropatriarchy is working to advance these culturally deficient arguments here. For example, regarding her sexual abuse, here it's a direct result of her mother's absence from the home, and it's in the context of economic migration that this neglect or abuse occurs. Further, the abandonment of her mother and the economic migration of her mother destabilized that ideological construction of the ideal family, as there is no patriarch or caretaker, but instead a grandmother and extended family. The result then is arguably the corresponding sexual abuse and gang harassment that takes place. And then lastly, gang violence is seen as an impetus for her fleeing El Salvador, while the lack of law enforcement protection is arguably the reason why it's not in her best interest to be returned. So let's look at another one. So this is the case of Jonathan. He's from Guatemala. After being threatened and beaten by gang members, he fled Guatemala at the age of 15. In Guatemala, he was unable to attend school because his parents couldn't afford it. Instead, they owned a small plot of land, and he started helping them cultivate it at the age of 8. While working, sometimes he would get hurt and like cut, but because his parents couldn't afford to get him medical care, he just had to deal with the injuries that he would get as a result of the work. Other thing is, his father would drink sometimes and beat him and leave bruises on his body. However, that's not the reason why he's leaving to the United States. It's after being threatened and beaten by gang members, he decides to go to the United States and go live with his maternal aunt. here. So in this case, he qualifies for SIJS because his father abused him, and arguably his parents neglected him by not providing medical care and not having him in school. And again, it's not in his best interest to be returned because of the gang threats coupled with the abuse that he suffered in his home. So taking that step back again and putting our lens of heteropatriarchy, in this case we see the theme of the father as the source of abuse. However, we can also see how poverty is being framed as evidence of neglect. So the fact that Jonathan is not in school and instead he's helping his parents on this land, he would be, well, in the United States, it would be seen as neglect because under most state compulsory state attendance laws, children between the ages of 6 and 18 are required to attend school. So violations of those laws, also like truancy laws, a parent could end up being fined or even jailed. So in this case, the court can't fine or jail Jonathan's parents, but by applying these standards to this family in Guatemala, the court's projecting criminality on Central American parents for being poor. Secondly, not being able to afford health care when he was injured can be seen as evidence of neglect. And then, like I mentioned, like all the other SIJ cases, gang violence is like the determining factor that it's not in the best interest to return to his home country. So, what are the consequences of SIJS? Like previous takings and breakings of family, we can see how SIJS relies on the logic of heteropatriarchy that frames Central American families as the opposite of the U.S. ideal family. By doing so, these narratives frame the deviance of Central American family as a result of culture rather than a reflection of economic, social, and political forces which have given rise to complex families. For example, in neither case is there any mention of the U.S. intervention in the region that has led to these economic and political instabilities which have impacted how families are structured. And even in the case of sexual abuse, like Shannon's Speed work reminds us, private violence in the context of colonialism and imperialism and settler colonialism, it's linked to state violence, which in the case here is completely obscured. Within the judgments against parents, there's also this criminalization of bad parenting, particularly when parents rely on extended family to care for their children. Ultimately, by criminalizing the Central American family, SIJS projects criminalization onto migrants arriving to the United States. So this can further be complicated by what can be understood as like an imputed gang identity on Central American children. So through the repeated invocation of gang violence and impunity as a reason for humanitarian relief, SIJS narratives become projected onto all Central Americans, including those children that are fleeing gang violence. And so taken together, you have this culturally inferior rhetoric around Central American families, coupled with that linking of gang affiliations to all Central Americans. It ultimately works to not only racialize but criminalize Central American immigrants in the United States and helps to advance anti-immigrant policies. So this essentially justifies the detaining of families and separating of families. Bless you. We're almost done. I know I see some people dozing. We're almost done. Bear with me. So circling back to the issue of family separation, recall the government justified separating families where there is concerns about trafficking or criminal histories. Well, in light of the discursive criminalization we just discussed, we can see that these families were already deemed criminal before ever reaching the United States. Through each of these applications that's granted, the government has more than enough evidence which justifies, at least at the ideological level, family separation. Returning back to the story that I opened with at the beginning of the talk, this is the case for my client, my then client, who had no criminal history but was separated from his daughter. Ultimately, he was deported and his daughter was released to a caretaker and had to fight her own deportation case. And here we go. So, special immigrant juvenile status and humanitarian-based immigration benefits came out of intense advocacy and a push to incorporate a more humanitarian lens, a more human rights lens into the immigration system. And while these laws provide real material benefits, so like I said, in the case of special immigrant juvenile status, once you get it, you get a green card, you have a pathway for citizenship, you have work authorization. There's a lot of material benefits to getting this status. It ultimately reinforces, though, the racialization and criminalization of immigrants and immigrant communities. And so when we think about immigration reform, I would caution relying on the law as the main provider of immigrant justice. Rather, like Dean Spade reminds us in the context of like trans rights, transformative change can only occur through mass mobilization. And any political project around immigration must be directed by those affected by it, which are the migrants themselves. So through describing the constraints of the law and providing protections, and to a greater extent, recognizing humanity, my goal through this project is to provide a catalyst for scholars and practitioners to reflect on the effectivity of humanitarianism and human rights so that we can reimagine a political project that advances the lives of migrants without reinforcing the structures that seek to limit their life chances. So I want to end by saying, with past iterations of family separation, communities resisted, parents resisted, and there were mass mobilization efforts that led to challenges against those practices. In the context of family separation today and anti-immigrant policies more generally, we continue to see resistance, not just in the mass protest efforts against practices such as the use of detention or family separation or family detention, or more recently against the death of a mother and her children due to the state of Texas and their new border initiatives. But we also see resistance in the daily lives of migrants who, in the face of an ever-increasing crimmigration system, are resisting by challenging the notion of immigration deterrence, by seeking out futures, and by making the journey north. So this was the case for the children that we just talked about, right? They left and they decided to journey to the United States to secure a future, and so are others. And so while we strive for an immigration system that doesn't rely on categories of worthiness or that don't reflect logics of racism, white supremacy, or settler colonialism, I hope in the meantime we can support voices and communities that are actively resisting these practices. So I will end there. Thank you, and there's my contact info.